Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing the findings from the 2025 State of Human Cyber Risk Report. And we've got a great team of panelists here. So if you can go to the next slide. We've got Ashley Rose, our CEO and co-founder of Living Security. Wade Baker, co-founder of Cyentia, and he and his team did a lot of work on this report. And then we have two more individuals from Living Security. We have Kelly Harward, he's our VP of Product, and we have Chris Perrell, he's our Director of Data Science. So before I kick it off and turn it over to Ashley, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A box at the bottom. This will be a kind of a back and forth session between the panelists. So I encourage you to ask those questions, and if we don't get to them during the session, we will address those at the end. So Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ashley Rose, the founder and CEO at Living Security. At Living Security, our mission is bold and urgent. It's to reduce cybersecurity risk by empowering organizations with the visibility and tools needed to foster a secure and resilient workforce. So today's session is really anchored in our latest collaboration with the Cyentia Institute, a data-rich, evidence-driven look into where cyber defense is headed next, the human element. Our report is called Risky Business, and it's based on insights from over 100 organizations managing real-world human risk. And it validates something that many of us in cybersecurity already sense, but may not be quantifying, that 10% of our users are responsible for 73% of risky behavior. And that's not just a stat, it's a call to action. For too long, people have been treated as the problem in cybersecurity. And at Living Security, we see things differently. We believe that people can actually be your strongest defense. And that's why we built Unify, our human risk management platform, to transform those fragmented signals into intelligent, adaptive defense strategies that empower both users and security leaders. So what makes this report and today's conversation so critical is now we have numbers, patterns, and behavioral insights to not just see the risk, but act on it. We've moved past the era of generic security awareness training. This is about targeted, evidence-based intervention built on real data, real users, and real outcomes. So if your organization is ready to move from surface-level awareness to deep human risk intelligence, you are in the right place. It's great news. This report doesn't just show where risk lies, it gives you a roadmap to start changing it. So I'm excited today to dig into the data and show how organizations like yours are evolving from reactive to proactive and from compliance-driven to risk-reducing strategy.
That's awesome. It's good stuff. And I'll just say, as the representative from Scientia Institute here, that I was really glad to be involved in the analysis of this topic. Like Ashley said, it's super important. And there's relatively little data out there on it, especially data that measures efficacy and all the questions that you probably want to know. So we start this report and we'll start this webinar with this big question of what constitutes human risk. You might rephrase that as what even is human risk? What kinds of things do we need to measure it? And I just want to start by giving a call out. The data breach investigations report from Verizon is something I know a lot of people read and are familiar with. There are some interesting stats in that as a big picture view of the breach landscape. So that report in the latest one, 2025, said that 17% of all the breaches analyzed in the DBIR involve social engineering, which of course includes phishing. So pretty big percentage, but kind of buried in the context in the DBIR is an even bigger measure of what constitutes human risk. They have this notion of the human element, which they define as things like malicious insider activity, mistakes that are made, the social engineering and phishing, accidental disclosure, and several other things. And by that measure, the human element plays a role in like 60 to 75% of all breaches, depending on how you measure it. So a much bigger piece of the picture, if you will. And I think that means that we need a big picture view when we go to doing research and analysis of this kind of thing. So, Kelly, I think you have some things to share on how living security looks at that big picture of human risk.
Yeah, and I love that grounding in these data points from the DBIR, right? Like, as Wade said, there's a lot of room in terms of the human risk surface between that, roughly 1 and 6 that involve social engineering or phishing explicitly, and the closer to 3 and 4 that involve a broader perspective of the human element. So if we want to go to the next slide, I think this characterizes a little bit more about how we approach this really important concept that is foundational to human risk management in our unified platform. As we're all aware, modern enterprises rely on a wide array of technologies across security, IT, and even HR. You've got email security tools that detect phishing and BEC attempts. You've got identity solutions managing user privileges and authentication. You have endpoint protection and DLP and CASB and insider risk and HRIS. And of course, you have security awareness training, right? Each of these holds a piece of the human risk puzzle, but the problem is none of them have the full picture. Human risk signals don't live in just one control. A user who's vulnerable to phishing and has excessive privileged access and is using unsanctioned apps, and maybe they were just flagged for a performance issue in HR, that's a high-risk situation. But you don't see that convergence of signals in any one tool, unless, of course, you have Living Security's unified platform. But that's especially true in the best-of-breed environments that we operate in. You might have Microsoft 365 for email, Okta for identity, CrowdStrike for endpoint, Workday for HR, KnowBe4 for training, and each one is doing its job, but none of them is designed to correlate risk across domains or help you prioritize based on who presents the greatest risk exposure. And so this is why we have a strong belief, and it's this belief in our platform that's given rise to the data that we're going to deep dive into in the report today. But human risk management needs to function as a connective layer. It's not about replacing your stack. It's about integrating across it to synthesize the data that actually reflects human-centric risk. And so you need to be able to pull in signals across many disparate systems, contextualize them, and then most importantly, turn that into action. Who needs coaching? Who needs access reviews? Who needs investigation? And without that unified view, you're blind to the risk that exists between the silos. And that's where real incidents often originate.
And I think it's important to mention here, as we're about to analyze a lot of statistics from this report, that the kinds of things that you see here are the inputs that we're actually analyzing. So we'll talk about the most common risk signals that were observed and visibility across the wide spectrum of human risk. These integrations are where we're getting that data that we analyze in the report and that we'll be going over here. So I think it's good to keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's do that, in fact. All right, so we've touched on this, but I think expanding on that topic, all right, we were very, very conscious from the beginning of this report, not just to analyze a single silo of what constitutes human risk. We wanted to look at everything. And that includes, as this diagram here says, user behaviors, both good and bad, events, that would include things like, a phishing email or a malware being detected or other things like that that happen to users. And then attributes are another aspect of human risk that we wanted to consider. So that might be the role of the user, as Kelly mentioned a few times, their level of access, and even things like tenure. So all of these things together are 3 categories that we wanted to look at. And again, we're getting that from the integrations and other things that you saw in the previous slide. So behaviors, events, attributes, we'll show you we'll break down these at various points as we move forward. But there's another layer too that we'll get into, and that is that um, those signals, behaviors, events, and attributes are not, I mean, they're risky. Some of them tell us that a particular user may be a risk concern. There's some examples of common risky signals that organizations will start with when they're building a human risk management program. So I think this is probably what most people think about, these kinds of things when they think about managing human risk. But it's not all about negative, right? There's also some positive things you might want to be aware of, things that tell you that this user may be less risky or maybe actually doing things to lower risk for the organization. And that's where Living Security uses the term vigilant. So these risk signals or risk insights are also vigilant. And they're good things if you want to look at them like that. Again, there's some examples there on the left. And then there's also neutral signals that in and of themselves aren't necessarily risky or vigilant, but they're good information and they provide context to some of the other things. So we'll get into various of these as we move forward through the data. You'll see these again, but just to level set on some of the things that you're looking at as we analyze all of this. So Kelly, I think this you may have some insight here, or is this a Chris part? But all of these things, 100 million risk signals is in the data set that we analyzed for this study, which is a lot. And we had it across all of those behaviors, events, and attributes. So a lot going on there.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think this sort of gets to the heart of the main challenges we're tackling in human risk management, which is really around taking all of these disparate data sources, sort of the landscape of security tooling that looks different in every organization, changes every year. Kelly kind of talked through some of the integrations that we have already, but we're always seeing kind of a variety of different data that help us understand how people are interacting with internal data, how people are interacting with each other, how your people are interacting with external entities or being targeted by external entities. And a key challenge in sort of getting this holistic scoring and representation of risk in place is first identifying your people and tying them together across all these systems. So AI-based entity resolution across dozens of different security vendors in your security landscape is kind of the first step. Who's in my organization? What systems are they working in? And what signals can we extract from that to attribute to those individuals and to the groups of people in the organization? Beyond that, next is to kind of take those signals and break them down into indicators of risk or indicators of vigilance. And Wade, you touched on kind of the difference between the behavioral indicators or things that your people are responsible for, have control over, versus threats or inherent risk that is posed from outside the organization. So being targeted by a malicious email or someone trying to crack a password or log in with your credentials, you don't have any control over, but they are inherent risk for attributed to that individual, or at least to their credentials, and should be monitored for the organization. So, thinking about those two kind of very distinct ways that risk can surface, we believe there are a couple different approaches toward measuring and characterizing that risk. So on the one hand, we do want a holistic view of risk that takes into account these behaviors, threats across all the platforms that you might be involved in. And that's where our human risk index comes into play. AI-based probabilistic approach that's looking at all of the potential indicators and sort of over time assessing how likely is this person or the accounts that this person's involved with, how likely is it that that is a source of risk or a continued source of vigilance in my organization, versus a more maybe human understandable behavior score that's based purely on those behavioral signals. And this is a score that you could share with your employees that specifies specifically, here are the things that you did that can be improved, or here are the things that you're doing that you should continue. These are vigilant activities like reporting phishes or staying compliant with company policies. So, after we have these ways of kind of objectively measuring the likelihood of risk and the involvement of individuals in vigilant and risky behaviors, next is really being able to make recommendations on where those pockets of risk live and what can be done to mitigate that risk or improve vigilance. And then lastly, how do we take action on that? So we can make recommendations here, point out here are the pockets of risk that could be improved. Empowering the user to then take action to actually affect that change and intervene on risk or encourage more vigilant behavior. This could be by sending out company scorecards. This could be nudging internal employees via your communication channels to take training, reinforce training, but really enabling those actions to be able to fully protect the organization is kind of the important step. And then, of course, lastly, we want to be able to report on this. The same techniques we're using to measure who's a risk in the organization. We want to be able to detect that use that to detect where interventions need to happen, enable and encourage actions to be taken, and then measure again and say, how did we move the needle? Have we improved security posture across the org?
Appreciate that. I think that's really good context, everyone, as you think about slides like this. So where we started in all of this, of course, it's hard to manage human risk if you can't see it or measure it, or you have no idea what's going on. And so that's where we started. This chart that you see takes a bunch of organizations. Each organization is a dot here, and asks what proportion of all those human risk signals that we have shown a couple times can any individual organization see? What do their capabilities allow them to detect and observe? And this is a bit of a journey, right? Because thinking back to all of those integrations, an organization that has all of those integrations and all of that telemetry flowing in about all aspects of human risk is going to be a much larger proportion of all human risk signals. So what we're measuring here is we looked at all of the organizations across the entire time slice and said, was this risk signal ever observed? If it was, then it is one of the ones that we looked at. So, can my organization see what all of my peer organizations are seeing when it comes to human risk? So you can see a wide variety here. On the lower end of the spectrum, sitting at 11, 12%, are organizations they see. That's literally 12% of all the spectrum of human risk as we've defined it. They're able to see based on the integrations that they have. On the other end, you have organizations that are seeing 2/3, almost 3/4 of all of those. And so this is where we say this is a maturity journey. And I know we had a lot of internal discussions about this. Ashley, you in particular were interested in, okay, if you have only security awareness training, what can you see versus, someone who is more mature in their human risk program? And that certainly is more over to the right.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because we're entering a market that over the last, call it multiple decades, has primarily been focused on that training compliance and the phishing simulations. We really wanted to understand and quantify, what is that sort of claim of visibility that a human risk management platform could offer the market. And what's even more important, like that kind of part of that question, is it helps us get to the core of why this work matters. So I'm going to break this down a little bit from our perspective. When we talk about human risk visibility, you stated it in very precise, right? Very factual terms. What we're really talking about is turning lights on in a room that's been in the shadows for far too long, right? As you're depicting here, and I think If you move to the next slide, most organizations are really only seeing a fraction of the risk they're actually exposed to, right? You had the slide here, right? They're detecting about 42% of those human risk signals that they're capable of seeing, right? That's not just a technology problem, but it's actually a strategic blind spot for our organization. But here's really the opportunity as well, right? When you increase that visibility, you're not just gathering data, but you're getting the insight into the behavior, into those behaviors, those threats, those identity insights that are really having an impact on risk. And now we can start to understand why incidents are happening, right? Who is most at risk? And then what interventions are the most effective, which really helps us move from that reactive one-size-fits-all target to a more targeted and impactful risk reduction program. And I mentioned earlier I was on site with a customer, but I have this conversation, I would say daily. What's even more important than the shift in the program is that visibility builds trust, right? And it empowers our security teams to engage the business, not now as the Department of No, but as a partner in resilience. And these are the conversations that we're having at the CISO level table on a daily basis. So when users are seeing that risk is contextual, it's behavioral and actionable, not just punitive, the culture starts to engage differently. And then they actually become a part of the solution. So that's extremely exciting. So just to kind of wrap it up, yes, improved visibility unlocks the opportunity to reduce incidents, but it's also enabling a cultural shift and one where security is embedded into everyday decisions, right? And that's supported by data, it's supported by real context, and that's really how we build a stronger, smarter, and more resilient workforce around security. So this means even more to me, and I think some customers than some of the data points on the screen. And I think the last slide here that I wanted to kind of comment on, you mentioned the journey. And that I think the slide and your statement really captures a core truth about human risk management. It's not a flip of a switch. I oftentimes see security teams getting in their own way because they're aiming for perfection at the sake of progress. And I don't think that's the right approach here. And so, as you can see on the left slides, we're starting to see the early stages of visibility, and this is where most organizations begin. It's where those 12%, right, 12% visibility really gets started. It's surface level signals like basic phishing simulations or overdue training modules. It's the starting point, but the impact on risk reduction is modest because it's only scratching the surface. And so as we shift right, and as organizations mature, they're moving beyond awareness into insight, right? Identifying deeper behaviors, tying that to identity and data handling, and even response to external threats. And that's really where risk amplifiers come into view, right? It's where we can start prioritizing our interventions based on actual risk and not just compliance metrics. And so we'll probably touch on some more of this, of like what that looks like in maturity. I'll kind of leave us here. Just like any maturity model, progress requires intention. And so I think we can even jump, let's not jump back, but let's in our minds go back to probably about 10 slides ago. The more data streams that you're integrating, the more visibility, right, that you're actualizing. We can start building responsive playbooks and truly get that generic training shift to those targeted coaching and behavior interventions. And so, that's really what we mean when we talk about closing the loop on human risk management. It's at every level for every team, and it is a journey. It's a maturity progress. So we're excited to partner with our customers, obviously, that we analyzed here, and happy to talk more about what that could look like at an individual level with anybody that's interested.
Excellent. So we've measured visibility, if you will, and see that different organizations have varying degrees of visibility into human risk, and they're improving that. The next question, at least to us, was okay. Well, how prevalent, how common is human risk or these human risk signals across organizations? So here there are 5 categories of human risk signals or insights that you should just kind of tuck away as we go forward in this presentation. There are quite a few signals related to security training and compliance. Again, I think that's where a lot of people start, but that's not the end all be all. There's a lot of insights or signals around data loss. How is data going out of the organization and risk associated with that? There's identity threats and access management and all of those kinds of things. Lots of risk signals. Malware and ransomware is certainly one that is important. And again, you may think, wait a second, I thought we were talking about human risk. Malware is code. It's not a person. It's not wetware. It's software. But a lot of times the people are, required to execute it or whatever, or send it or respond to it. So that's what we're wanting to keep an eye on here. And then similar for phishing and email and those kinds of things. So you'll see these categories as we go forward, but just know that behind them are lots of ways to observe and measure risk signals associated with each of these. All right. So same 5 categories that we just talked about. Again, we have the dots representing organizations. And what we wanted to measure here with this chart is the proportion of each organization's, all of the risk signals that they've detected. What proportion is in each of these categories? And there's several things that I think are very interesting here. One, organizations are all over the place. I think it would be difficult to say, well, identity and access management is going to be my number one thing because it's the number one thing for all my peer organizations, because just the how much you see these organizations spread out in terms of that measure is important. It means that there's a unique human risk profile that is probably for your organization that may be very different from other organizations that you know or talk to. So understanding where you are is important because of this very wide spread. And just so we're on the same page as what this means, let's look at this blue dot up at the top for identity and access management. That is an organization for which very few, I'm going to call it 1% of all of their observed human risk relates to identity and access. Okay. Then on the other side is an organization that's like 70% of all of its observed human risk signals are in the identity and access category. So, if you are managing human risk in either one of those organizations, you're either going to really, really, really have to focus on identity and access as a primary cause for concern, or maybe you should move on and focus on something else because it's such a small portion. So understanding that is really important. And so in general, you can see that if we just take the average lines, which are the bars in the middle, identity and access management is more prevalent, or risk associated with that is more prevalent than some of the other categories. But it's all over the place, right? You have organizations that are very high in each of these. So I go back to understanding that human risk profile. What might be most prevalent for you might be different for somebody else. So that tells me that understanding that is very important.
If I could add on.
Yeah, please do.
Like you said, the main thing I think to take away here is across these broad categories of security risk, every organization's security journey is different. The layout of the sources of signals or risk indicators that they can tap into, the tooling that they're using, the availability of that data that we can resolve back and build these scores around is going to look different. But I think the other thing that was a bit surprising to me when we saw this was how much of that signal is outside of the maybe traditional focus on phishing and email, or even if you take phishing, email, and training, there are a significant number of highly impactful indicators that we can capture from identity access, malware, data loss that fall outside of those kind of traditional email and security awareness training streams. I think it's also important to note, not captured here, but important to note that these indicators are not all the same, right? In terms of how impactful they are on risk. So while data loss may be at a low representation of the total number of indicators that are surfacing for one organization, typically the indicators from that category are very highly impactful on those risk scores I mentioned earlier. So whereas while there are certainly highly impactful indicators in the identity and access management as well, just because it's overrepresented or more highly represented in the number of indicators, some of those may be more innocuous or of lower importance than in the data loss category. So an important piece to all of this is, yes, getting good coverage from all of these categories and getting good coverage from the data sources that we can tap into, but also putting in the time and the research to understand which of those are the most important, how should they be affecting these scoring algorithms, and how do we sort of correlate the higher versus lower valued risk items in that score. If you switch to the next slide, I think this gives kind of a nice just a different view of some of the same data, where for some select indicators that we've got listed out here, there's the list of percentage of organizations that had signals for those indicators versus across all the organizations, how many protected users are being detected. And again, getting back to kind of what I was saying on the last slide about sometimes like volume of indicator isn't the main thing to look at. We have to understand what's being detected and how impactful is that. For example, I think there's a couple on here. Yeah, with 29% of orgs are getting detections around someone taking action on a simulated phishing website, so failing a simulated phishing campaign, and malware detection, right? But the total number of users is an order of magnitude difference, 2% versus just 0.1% that are being detected. We don't want to just rely on the statistics around how often these things are happening or who they're happening to determine how impactful they need to be on HRI. Because in a lot of cases, some of these like malware detection is going to be significantly more impactful than maybe like a failed training or something like that. And then I also thought that some of those stats off to the right definitely were surprising. I mean, seeing the percentage of users or organizations that had simulated phish clicking, failed login attempts, gives you a sense of how noisy some of these signals can be, but also how prevalent some of these signals can be.
Yeah, I think it's a good point you made there about if you look at the proportions of users that are generating some of these risk signals, pretty low numbers. And I think that highlights part of the challenge here, right? If you just say, all right, there's one user that's causing all the problems, not going to be the case. It's a small number. It's not 50%. None of those numbers are super high. They're fairly low. So it sort of has this message of the ability to identify the relatively few users that are engaged in some of these things that you might be concerned about is important to managing human risk. But it's always challenging when you're trying to find the needle in the haystack,
Yeah,
so-
wait, I'll jump in here. I think, sometimes we talk about, with customers, they're like, well, why can't I take some of this signal, like some of these signaling, and then throw it into a BI dashboard, and like, look, that's where a lot of us started. It's actually like, as from a founding team, before we had a company, like trying to manage some of this within spreadsheets and BI tooling was like the start of Living Security. But I think what this data shares that's so important, it's not about number of signals or quantity of a type of signal. It actually gets down to impact and prioritization. And that's what, like, where our unique value, right, is found kind of up front within a human risk management program. I want to bring that data to life with an example of one of our customers. We have this organization had over 100,000 global employees. So you can imagine a ton of behavioral data, both good, bad, and everything in between. And, they had to ask the question, like, where am I going to start? Right. And so if we were just starting at, an area that had the highest quantity, we may be missing something that was driving like the most risk or real impact to the company. But like many, they did started targeting social engineering risk. And so, but instead of looking at like who are the people that just clicked, they've combined employee behavior, right? Click rate with both simulation as well as real phishing. They also looked at role-based access, and then they looked at inbound threat telemetry. And that was able to prioritize their efforts. And so one of the early insights that stood out was that contractors were significantly underreporting suspicious activity. And the group as a whole showed those low vigilance scores, right? We talked about vigilant versus risk. This is one area. So rather than just flagging the risk, this customer designed a contractor-specific training flow and kind of workflow within our system. And it was within weeks that we started seeing an impact. They doubled the rate at which contractors were proactively reporting to the SOC, which wasn't just a win for awareness, but it was actual real measurable impact on response readiness. And it didn't stop there, right? Once they were able to show that quick win, it sparked momentum in the organization. So then we expanded into visibility to include users with exceptions to USB access, right? So now we're jumping from social engineering. We're now looking at endpoint hygiene. This group was known to carry elevated risk, right? And so by analyzing the behaviors and threat patterns of these users, we now have deployed additional custom training tied directly to those risk profiles. And then again, we said, okay, what's next? What else is causing risk? Where else are we seeing impact? We're now looking at signals tied to frequent travelers. We're looking at login locations, time zones, endpoint hygiene. So again, you can kind of see how this continues to pick up momentum, right? There's a little bit of a snowball effect, but we're actually jumping from one category to the other, not purely based on number of signals or prevalence, right, from that matter, but actually impact to the organization, which is derived through, these additional contextualized data points.
Good stuff. So from these sort of relatively few users, you get, a lot of risk. We thought, maybe some employees are riskier than others. I think this is a little bit of, you probably know where this is going. Ashley shared the stat earlier, but let's show you how we got there, right? So this chart was not in the report, so you won't find it. This is just included for this to explain what's going on here. It's a distribution of the percentage of an organization's risky signals or insights that each user is responsible for generating. So if you can read the percentages down there, they're pretty low. So that red dashed line is 0.01%. That's the average. That's the typical user generates 0.01% of all the risk signals for their organization. And then over here, this other line, very few, the very long tail. If you're generating 1% of your organization's risk signals, you're way out in the tail in terms of risky users. So the moral of the story here is that users in and of themselves, each individual user is responsible for a pretty low proportion of risk signals. However, there are still some that are far riskier than others. And that's where this chart comes in, which looks at all the behavior-based signals that are generated and ask if we take the top 10% of users in terms of the ones that generated the highest number of behavior-based risk signals, what proportion of the whole do those represent? And those top 10% of users are responsible for almost 3/4, 73% of all risky behavior for their organizations. And I think this is a really important stat for understanding and managing risk in your organization. We don't know necessarily yet who those users are, but we do know that there's a subset that we can narrow in on if you really want to have an impact and make a difference in terms of managing human risk.
Yeah,
and I imagine you guys do this all the time.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
Wait, I think this is really one of the most eye-opening insights in the report. Just 10% of users driving 73% of risky behavior. And what's even more important to understand is that most of the behavior isn't malicious. It's unintentional, habitual, or even like simply uninformed. We'll get into a little bit of that breakdown, I think, in the next section. But what does this really mean for us is how we manage that risk matters, right? It means that traditional punitive or one and done training approaches simply don't work. We can't train once a year and hope behavior magically changes. We need this continuous visibility, ongoing coaching, and the context-driven interventions that align with how people actually work. And this is really why human risk management matters, right? It enables us to monitor those trends, spot risk early, and intervene with precision. And so when we talk about building that resilient workforce, this is what it looks like, right? Consistent monitoring, care and feeding, and investing in people, not just technology platforms.
And I want to add here that that bar you saw was overall. We showed you these 5 categories of human risk signals earlier, and just note that they are different. Data loss, for example, is a little bit more lopsided when it comes to the distribution of risk across users. So, there it's higher than 75%, whereas for identity and access management, it's just a little over 50%. So still both high numbers, but depending on what category of risk, we see a little bit difference in terms of what those top 10% of users represent in terms of those categories. So I think we'll move into users. Ashley mentioned something a moment ago, that it's not all about risk, right? When we think of managing human risk, I know that risk is in the phrase there, but we also want to know what users are driving risk and which users are lowering risk. They might be vigilant. And so we dove into this. Now, this you'll have to pardon. We had a good time with this one. Some of you that are into D&D or have seen it might know that there's this notion of character alignment, and you have these lawful good, which is often the paladin, and they follow law and they do good. And you kind of have these different types of breakdowns, and they all follow these alignments. And we got to just internally talking, hey, I wonder if enterprise users have similar types of alignment in terms of risk, and can we measure that and group them similarly? And we were very excited that we could indeed do that. So the 4 boxes that you see: lawful, vigilant, chaotic, vigilant, lawful, risky, chaotic, risky. I know lawful is a little bit weird, but that's a D&D term, and we wanted to be true to it. Lawful in this context is that they do the same thing over and over again. It's almost like they are following a set of rules, like they always click the phishing email, or they always finish their training, or whatever it is. They do the same few things over and over. And chaotic is just, they're all over the place. It's hard to predict their behavior. They have all kinds of events happening to them, and it's highly diverse and varied. So keep that in mind. There's a few things that I think are super interesting, and this is just not all fun and games, letting us scratch our sort of geek impulses here. But when you look at the top half of this, that's the proportion of all users that are more vigilant than risky, and it's 78%. Almost 8 in 10 of all users actually are doing more to reduce risk for their organizations than adding to it. And I love that, because it just flies in the face of that notion that sometimes is prevalent in security communities of, users are all of our problems, stupid users. If we could just get rid of them, our networks would be secure. And I think it's way, way, way more complicated than that. And I think this holds some really important lessons for us in terms of how we leverage what these users are doing. Like, how can we turn these vigilant users and encourage them and build on them and start changing human risk in the organization? So 78% are more vigilant than risky. And then also 55, a little bit over half, are, quote, more lawful. In other words, they're doing the same kinds of things, whether that's vigilant or risky, over and over again, I also think that's important because if you can narrow in on what those are, you are more able to do something about it, right? It's not like they're all over the place. Most of risk is just can't even predict what in the world anybody is going to do. A lot of it is this sort of commonplace, routine, recurring type stuff. And I think that bodes well for management. And wrapping all of this up, if we can put some words on it of what you can do with this information. Again, it's not all fun and games. I think there's some useful takeaways here. If we can take those lawful vigilant users in your environment, encourage them, right? They're doing a few things over and over again that are good, that are reducing risk. We'll encourage them to do more things, right? Like maybe if they knew about them, they would be happy to do more that would help your organization. For those chaotic vigilant users that are just doing all kinds of wonderfully risk-reducing behaviors, let's empower them to do even more. Let's empower them to encourage others. We want these to be your security champions, right? They're the ones that are doing all the right things all the time. So let's get behind them. For the lawful risky, the ones that are doing those same few things that we don't want them to do time and time again, we got to coach them. You know, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Let's do this instead. And then those chaotic risky, we can't predict what they're doing. They're doing all kinds of stuff. May not be able to coach them yet, but you got to contain them somehow so they don't harm the organization, right? And then see if we can kind of narrow the range of their riskiness and then bump them up to the lawful vigilant category, maybe even. But I love this because there are some things that we can do, and this can drive your risk management strategy and help to tailor it to what your user profile is like across your organization.
Yeah, wait, this is kind of maybe one of my favorite visuals, and you stated it all very well. And that what I love about the model is it opens the door for actions in every direction. I mean, can you imagine trying to contain your lawful vigilant or chaotic vigilant users? Like that's going to be depressing for them, right? They're going to maybe not do the appropriate and vigilant behaviors that you really need to cause risk reduction for the organization. Or maybe you're trying to coach them. Wait, and what does this look like? It means ongoing training that we're force feeding to everybody in our organization when maybe they don't need it. And this is really where the visibility really matters, because with the visibility and then the right segmentation and breakdown, we can really respond to risk, build champions, reinforce good behavior, and align incentives across the organization. And I think that's really the true power of human risk management. It's built on behavior, not compliance.
Mm. Yeah, and I think this chart goes hand in hand with what you were saying there, Ashley. And I don't want to dwell too long on this one, but users can be in these classifications for behavior-driven things, so things that user directly is doing, but also for event-driven. Chris mentioned it before. You know, the fact that you are targeted for phishing emails and malware isn't a behavior on your part. Now, whether you click them or do something with them is, but if you look at that lawful risky category, it's about half and half of things the user is doing and responsible for and things that they are not doing. So let's just say you had a training program and they perfectly complied and changed their behavior perfectly, which isn't going to happen, but let's just say it did. You'd only be solving half of the issue, right? You're not going to drive them from being risky just by something that corrects behavior. So different categories and ratios here, but I think that's an important point as you think about what do you do about this. All right. I think we're getting close to time, so I want to just share a few slides here in the report. If you can hit them if you want more information. But we took those different user alignments, human risk alignments, and looked at them across contractors and executives. Some of those attributes that we talked about, and I think some of these are fairly surprising in the sense that you know, certain ones are more or less risky than you might think. I like to call out the remote because there's just, you know, the whole return to the office and other kinds of things, and are remote riskers inherently, remote users inherently risky. And this kind of says, yeah, not really, based on the data that we're seeing here. It might not go the way you think it's going to go. And in fact, tenured users are a little bit more likely to be chaotic risky, fit in that chaotic risky profile than remote or even contractors. So understanding how these things play is going to help you manage risk. And then also, in terms of your organization, there are what you do in terms of generating revenue and business models and other kinds of things. We're seeing some differences across healthcare, education, financial services, industrial utilities in terms of the breakdown of these users. I can't really explain exactly why all these differences exist, but I can say that they do exist, and perhaps we should look into them. But I don't know, anyone on the Living Security team, stories or other insights on this kind of thing before we move to the last section?
I'll just add quick commentary because I think we need to move on. To your point, Wade, different industries have different human risk profiles, and then within each industry, different departments and teams carry very different risk burdens. And that's not just an IT insight, it's a business reality. And I mentioned CISO level conversations, right? What are they caring about? Security leaders can't own risk alone. Right? If human risk lives everywhere, then it has to be owned everywhere. And so we're seeing this growing trend where business unit leaders, VP of Ops, sales, HR, even product, are being held accountable for the performance and culture of their team when it comes to security. Or one of our CISOs said, it's the business leaders that own performance management. And security culture and security responsibility is a performance management issue. So our business leaders need to have the data and the insight to be able to be effective in driving performance management across their teams. And so I think that's where this really matters, right? Of having this insight, being able to communicate effectively, giving those business leaders the data and support to be able to have those contextual driven conversations with their teams and ultimately drive the security culture forward and upward, hopefully.
Hopefully. And we're seeing evidence of that. I think this last section here, can human risk actually be managed? It's an important question, obviously, because I think some people have kind of a defeatist attitude about human behavior and human-based risk. And I just want to say we're seeing some positive signs here. So this chart is looking at over the period of the year 2024, what proportion of all users in organizations were classified as risky. So we just showed you those risky profiles. Is your user more vigilant or more risky? About 43% of all users were classified as being more risky on average than not. Now, the little gray lines in the background are individual organizations. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation here and a lot of movement over time. That's an important point in and of itself. But the main takeaway is that over that period of a year, the ratio of risky users dropped from 43% to 21%. That's half. And that's definite positive momentum in the right direction, right? We want fewer users that are increasing risk in our organizations. And I think most companies would call that a win if you could decrease your risky user population by half. Another thing that we looked at, so overall risky users and proportions, that's what we just said. But this one, can we definitely tell that certain things are effective? And Living Security has action plans. And so what we did to measure this was we measured, this is the top set of arrows there, each user's time in a risky state. They were considered risky out of a 90-day period before they had an action plan, and then for a 90-day period after the action plan. And we analyzed the delta between that pre-action plan and post-action plan risk. And on average, users spent 60% less time in a risky state after those action plans. And again, that's a big difference, right? And that difference varied across these different categories that you've seen. So for data loss, that was a dramatic reduction, 98%. For identity, 51%, but all of these averaged out to a 60% less time in a state that is classified as risky before and after action plans. I think that really is encouraging in terms of, yes, we actually can do things to lower risk and do so measurably.
Just a couple thoughts here. I really do see this as kind of one of the main take-homes of human risk management, and that step one is find a way to accurately and objectively measure risk in the organization. Step two is identify an action to take, an intervention, and a way to improve that risk. And then, we want to, after some time, measure again and say, did we objectively move the needle and bring that propensity for risk down over time? And I think the results here definitely support that. I think it's also important to kind of understand that when we talk about time in a risky state and why we're looking at ranges of time is because the score for an individual, or the likelihood of an individual being a risky component to your risk landscape, is it's a spectrum, right? There's a continuum of risk and a likelihood of risk that changes over time. And we don't just want to snapshot at one point in time who is involved in these indicators and score one time, but look at what's the behavior and baseline that change of behavior for some period. And in this case, a quarter, let a quarter pass and measure that over time, how many people stay in that state. And noting that it's not just risk, right? It's so yes, did individuals continue to do something risky and kind of keep them in that elevated state of risk, but also did certain individuals start doing something vigilant, or did they do vigilant things and continue to do that after the first time? So we want to see that we've maintained that vigilant behavior for some period of time within any time we're kind of measuring the amount of risk. So yeah, I think that's kind of an important piece, that following the vigilance of the individuals is important here.
Sounds like a good topic for more
Chris.
research.
Yeah, Wade, we'll have to continue the research here. I would say within the last two slides, we as an industry, and specifically as a portion of the security industry, the awareness training, human risk team, we have been grasping for something to be able to prove the efficacy, the impact, and the effectiveness of our program. And that is so hard, right? Being able to effectively deliver a quantifiable ROI of the work that we're doing. And that's what these last two slides tell me, right? From my perspective, and what we're hoping to deliver to the industry is that the work that you do matters, and that there is an ROI, a positive ROI to a human risk management program investment. And that's so exciting, not just for human risk, but for security as a whole. And even more exciting that it means that our people can be an active part of our security strategy and defense posture. So I know we're coming up on time, so I'll probably quickly wrap us up here. And sounds like we have some more interesting areas to dig deeper into for a next scope of work. So we'll get that call set up afterwards. I think after everything we've seen today, one thing is extremely clear, that the way that we've been trying to manage risk, security awareness training alone is no longer enough. And really, traditional SAT programs were designed for a different time, right? A time when compliance was the goal and check the box was considered a win. But today we're managing dynamic human risk, and that demands more than static one-size-fits-all solutions. And the reality is, right, risk doesn't just stop at awareness. It lives in behaviors and decisions, context, and culture. And unless we're integrating training into real-time insights and coaching into workflows and action plans into systems, we're not closing the loop. We're just reporting the problem. So I think the next slide, and it's also in the report, it gives our viewers today some next steps, as well as some resources and call to action. So Carrie, yes, thanks for dropping those in the chat. We'll drop a link to the full report in here as well. And I see sort of a follow-up, not just with investigation and more data analysis, but just diving deeper into each one of these areas in different content. So Wade, thank you for your team and for your work on digging into this data. It's absolutely a major milestone for the human risk management and security industry. And of course, thanks to my team, as you can see here, they are the world's experts when it comes to human risk management as pioneers of this area. So, and thank you, of course, to our customers who have continued to partner with us in making these programs a reality and continuing to mature and push limits and bounds within their own security teams and programs. It's not just a side project, it's a strategic imperative. And we're really proud to be leading the movement with the world's most forward-thinking organizations.
Appreciate it. And thanks for joining, everybody. Really glad you decided this was worth your time, and hopefully you're at this point thinking it was. Do we have? I know we're at time, but do we have questions, or do we want to try to do that as a follow up or something along those lines, Carrie?
Yeah, a couple questions came in, so we can go ahead and take one. The first one that came in is, what is the difference in your scoring techniques that you mentioned earlier?
That sounds like one for Chris.
Yeah, I could take that. I touched on it a bit. The two main ways that we separate or score individuals in the organization are through the Human Risk Index, which really is our AI-powered probabilistic approach for bringing in both those behavioral signals and those sort of threats that maybe they don't have much control over. We think we know it's important to characterize both of these because they are significant, impactful indicators of risk for the organization. But it's also important to be able to characterize a user's risk in terms of things that they actually have control over, and that's usually where the behavior score comes in. It's purely focused on those behavioral indicators, typically focused only on the behavioral indicators that are highest priority to an organization for tracking and affecting change on. So we build a score around those, and with the anticipation that those scores could be shared with the individual to give them insights into areas that they can improve on risk, or areas they can continue to remain vigilant and keep their score high.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of other questions, but I see people are starting to jump off. Ashley and Wade, do you want to continue to take those?
Or I think we'll follow up. We'll take those questions, and I think we'll turn them into a blog post and send it out to the subscribers today, or the webinar registrants. So again, thank you all for joining, and appreciate everyone's support on this. And it was exciting to be here communicating the output of the work that we've been on for the journey we've been on the last few years. Thank you all.
Appreciate it.